Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, ladies and gentlemen, the alternate history podcast. I've got the full cast here today for another exciting adventure. We've got, in no particular order, I've got Robert Koshu.
Hello.
I've got Evan Buck.
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
And we all know what's about to come. Chris, do you have some nice words for the folks at home?
Hi, good people.
Gotta leave them waiting for a little bit. Okay, the gang is all here. So we are going to continue in our little adventure in the American Monarchy that we've been going down for a little bit. Just a quick rehash of where we were last time, where we ended off in the sort of late 1840s and 1850s. We have an Italian monarch, Ferdinando. He becomes king of America, and he ends up living. We'll say in this timeline until kind of the late 1860s. This is an America that stretches from, all the way in Alaska, all the way down to the Caribbean. They've taken territories from France, from Britain, from Spain, from Mexico, basically anybody who doesn't have their dirt nailed down. So this is a much broader and more contiguous America. And this is an America that's kind of much more, at least than our timeline, more evenly settled, because California and the West has been an American territory a little bit longer than it has in our timeline. There's been more kind of exploration out West. We also have an America that has much more uneasy relationships with most of the sort of elite societies of the world, partially because we've been stealing all of their royalty, and partially because we've been interfering and basically playing sort of the mean kid on the schoolyard with all of their grand plans and dynastic ambitions. So we are entering into the late 1800s in a world that's very much in flux, especially in Europe, as our start date may be just ahead of some very interesting things that are happening. So I'm going to kind of throw it to Chris, because we have the death of Fernando, King of America, and we have an open throne, and somebody's got to fill it. So who are we looking at in terms of our possibilities for who that might be?
So there's two original competitors for this that we thought about, and we'll develop that a little bit further. The first one being Leopold of the House of Hohenzollern. I am not even going to attempt what offshoot he was. He's not of the main line, but he is basically another Prussian monarch. But specifically, I wouldn't even call him a Prussian monarch anymore, because he is of the royal family of the North German Confederation by this point. The North German Confederation being a proto-German state that was literally it only existed for 4 years, between 1866 and 1870. And it was all of the, if you couldn't guess by the name, Northern German states united under Prussia, and it was basically created for the 7 Weeks' War against Austria. So the Northern German kind of Lutheran Protestant areas formed one country to go to war with the Austrian Empire / Catholic Southern states. Prussia won, and this war in 1866 kind of determined, okay, Prussia's going to be the German state. It's not going to be united by Austria. So he is one of the claimants put forward. The other claimant would be Maximilian, who is I'm going to ask Dylan.
I forget what his official title was.
Well, he's an Archduke of Austria. He's just not one of the primary heirs of the Habsburg Empire.
But what is his relation to Napoleon the Third? That's the question.
They're Sorry, go ahead,
They're
Robert.
buddies, for lack of a better term. He was a Habsburg,
Okay.
Lorraine, and so
Oh,
he's from the
Lorraine.
Franz Joseph Austria area.
Okay.
So they were
Well-
hanging out, and they were the ones who really wanted to be part of the French Empire from the beginning. They
Okay.
had hung out.
So the other claimant being Maximilian, who, if any American knows of him, it's because of when he was put on the throne of Mexico. He, about this time in 1862, I believe, France invades Mexico because of its foreign debts and installs Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. This is where Cinco de Mayo comes from. We did an episode on that, this war. But we don't think, it doesn't happen in this time, and nobody actually thinks it happens unless the United States is busy in our timeline with our Civil War. So that didn't happen. He's still hanging out in France, waiting for an open throne somewhere. So I think we have a German claimant, and a kind of Austrian-French claimant. And the idea we put forward was, even, most of us are familiar with Turtle Dove, or you wouldn't have really gotten into this deep into it. I think the Leopold the Hohenzollern is kind of the northern industrial favorite, and Maximilian is beloved by the southern United States because Joseph Bonaparte kind of created a big part of their cultural inheritance. So both of these candidates come to the United States, and neither one of them is really a clear-cut winner. Evan, do you want to talk about your kind of compromise candidate?
I was going to hop in here because I think while we were talking about this off podcast, I think I found someone that could serve much like in our own timeline in the 1860 election, where we had 4 different strong viable candidates running. I think in this alternate timeline, we can have someone who would possibly appeal to both the industrial North as well as the slave owning South. And that is a different Leopold, the one that you might have thought of as an astute historian yourself as soon as you heard that name. In our timeline, he goes by Leopold II, the King of Belgium. And what we are looking at here is, in our timeline, he takes over the throne, I want to say 1865, after his father passes away. But in this alternate timeline, in, let's say, 1868, he is actually a viable kind of compromise middle way candidate, because he does appeal to both sides. He's known as the Builder King in our timeline. He's known as someone who just has done a lot of work of industrialization, but he also can appeal to the South because in our timeline, and I would think in this timeline as well, he has a very strong personal stake, personal little pet project that he is working on, known as the Congo Free State. And I don't necessarily have to delve super deep right away into, chattel-based slavery and all of those sorts of issues, but I'll just say right here for the record that as a potential monarch who could fuse both interests together of both the North and the South, with a potential source of, free labor, essentially, to back himself up, I was wanting to also throw him into the mix as a sort of possible candidate. So we have 2 Leopolds facing off and Maximilian.
Because here's the other thing that just crossed my mind. The second Leopold is of what country?
He is also in Belgium, which is literally right in between the North German Confederation and the French.
You cannot be a Belgian monarch and not be a conciliator.
Nope, exactly. So this makes for a very fascinating 1860 because we have a very northern entrenched candidate, a very southern entrenched candidate, and a very, I'm going to try and do literally whatever I can to please both sides candidate. And what we discussed in the lead up to this was we think this leads to a very interesting situation. We think this leads to an election that has no clear, distinct winner. Now, in American politics, in our timeline, this led to some interesting situations like, House of Representatives with John Quincy Adams and some other elections as well that are escaping me at the moment. But some situations that kind of led to some constitutional reforms. In this timeline, I think we're going to have a little bit of a different mechanism for sorting out this difference of no majority. And it involves a little bit less clear maneuvering.
So
more forceful negotiations are going to take place.
A little bit more forceful negotiations, I think, is the nice way of putting it, Robert.
So first ballot.
One might even
Nobody
quote
wins.
a George Lucas script and say they were aggressive negotiations.
There you go.
Yes.
So first ballot, nobody wins a majority.
Yep.
Then I think, and if there's one person, if you've been listening to the podcast as long as I've been around, and if there's one thing I'm known for almost as much as loving you good people out there, it's Bismarck, and I think he comes in here. This, by the way, this was my master plan. They will all tell you this. I've been planning this for a while, but
he's been pre-gaming this for like 2 episodes.
I have, and not. I mean, like 2 episodes of this arc, because I know we're trying to intersperse.
Mhm.
Bismarck reports the dispatches he gets from Washington and basically paints Maximilian as a useless dilettante that got laughed out of the Senate chamber. This is basically a modern a different version of the M's dispatch, which insults the French candidate to the Spanish throne in our timeline and convinces the French to attack and declare war on Germany and start the Franco-Prussian War. That didn't go very well for them and is why Germany was a thing. I think he does it here because I think the American throne being open is just too wonderful an opportunity. So you have Bismarck insulting Maximilian, and France goes to war with Germany. That plays out the way it does in our timeline very quickly. But once sabers are drawn, this is what we discussed this is the American Civil War.
We get drawn into it.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, this is what happens. And for the Gen Zers who might be listening, to put it in Gen Z terms, basically the Franco-Prussian War in our timeline happened because Bismarck sent mean tweets.
Yes.
Like, I'm not kidding.
No.
That's basically the equivalent of what happened.
I might include the M's dispatch in the show notes. That is literally what happened.
Mm-hmm. And so
for all of you wondering out there right now, there's no way X's are ever going to turn into anything policy-wise. Nope, they have. Yeah,
they have.
Kind of why
They're
Germany
instead of
became a thing.
tweets, they're telegrams. It's literally what happened.
Yeah.
So
I'm pretty sure they also use Telegram as an app nowadays. Anyway, go.
Yep, exactly. So we have now what we've constructed here is we have the first ballot, 3-way, not producing a clear, conclusive winner. Otto von Bismarck starts putting his hand into the American cookie jar. And for the astute listeners, that's another reference to another episode that may or may not be out at this point. But carefully listen for that reference. So he's got his hands in the American cookie jar. And now we have, Franco-Prussian War. Now we have this timeline's version of the American Civil War. So where are the battle lines going to be drawn, gentlemen? Because we got the North versus the South again. But this is not so much a war over the existence of slavery and states' rights as it was in our timeline. And let's be honest, if you talk to the Lost Causers, if you talk to people, they're like, oh, it was states' rights. And then you see Jefferson Davis and all of those Confederate leaders, and they're basically like, it was over slavery, and we're using states' rights also as our cover, as our way.
It was the excuse.
It was the excuse. So either way, however you look at it, if you want to call it slavery, you want to call it states' rights, in our timeline, this is going to be a conflict that is much more based upon an American succession crisis, really.
Well, and what they were trying to protect at this point in this timeline is the agricultural economy that they had said that because you have to remember in our time, in our current timeline, the quote unquote cotton South was really relegated to Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. Texas, sort of, no one else really had it. But now we've expanded an agricultural belt all the way across into Southern California, with Utah holding on to slavery, as well as Cuba, down in Veracruz, some parts of Baja. Go ahead, Chris.
It goes from Palo Alto to Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it
Exactly.
is a much more massive and it's not as much over slavery, although slavery's there. It's really, hey, we've got to protect this agricultural economy.
Well, I
as
think it's all
Yeah.
slavery. I mean, slavery is at the heart of all.
Well, you have to have slavery to keep the agricultural economy
Right.
going.
Right.
That's the thing.
Well, that and
Yeah,
there's also going to be more in this timeline than in our timeline, at least, of a religious component to it. Not
Yes.
not necessarily overtly, because this is an era where we're moving away from sort of the more, outwardly religious sort of nation and governance structures of the Middle Ages, but it's very much still a more devout time. This is in the middle of the Second Great Awakening, or just past it in, our real American timeline. So you're going to see, a French Catholic Austrian South association versus a sort of Northern German Protestant association.
And then we have the Belgian.
Well,
I'm going to put in air quotes, Catholic.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. I don't think it's like the Texans, who they nominally became Catholic.
Yeah.
In order to get land. Like,
I think,
at least as far as I understand, Leopold was not a devout.
Well, we did kind of discuss the importance and the openness of the Northern Plains to Irish Catholic immigration.
Yes. And also, I'm thinking there's at least some more unease on some of the big ports on the East Coast. Like, you look in our Civil War, all the Irish immigrants getting literally basically handed $5 off the boat to go register for the Union Army. I think if anything like that immigration is still coming in from predominantly Catholic countries, I don't know that there's going to be a that much of a real impact, but it's very much going to be at least a perception of a possible impact that politicians in this situation are going to be concerned about. So I think
you mean potential disloyalty of an Irish element.
Disloyalty, possible, Irish Catholic brigades going down south instead of fighting for the north. Just some more general kind of uneasiness up north than we may have seen in our timeline.
It becomes more of a true civil war in the sense that it's not as much a clearly defined north-south.
Yeah, it's less of a geographic. It's more of a true kind of brother against brother. Nobody's really sure what their neighbors are thinking. And let's also not forget, speaking of religion, we also have Utah still in the mix, because Brigham Young has been out in Utah for basically an extra decade, essentially with tacit government approval to administer a good chunk of the Southwest.
And the important thing here is, because we've extended kind of an agricultural belt, because we split California, there's no real settlement yet in West Texas, in New Mexico, really much in Arizona yet. But because there is an agricultural base in Southern California, the Confederacy extends to the Pacific. And now the Utah you're talking about is actually, it's another Kentucky. It's on the border between the two groups.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think
last episode we did discuss like the borders being a little different, because it's more so along the line of what Brigham Young envisioned Deseret to be.
Yes.
As opposed to what we think of as Utah. in our timeline.
Yeah, and I'm picturing, Brigham Young being a very, politically savvy, you know, religious leader and political figure. In this timeline, at least at first, I'm envisioning him sitting back, waiting to see what cards are in everybody's hands. He's going to sit in the middle and not do anything.
Exactly what
be
Kentucky did in our timeline, declare themselves neutral.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got much more territory than Kentucky that he's got. So he's even from a sheer logistics standpoint, when we start getting into the tactics and the battlefield layouts, Brigham Young's territory, what I guess we can call Deseret in this timeline, because I'm sure that's what they would start calling it, is it's going to be a major thing to at least keep in the back of our minds. It has to be worked around by everybody in this once it starts getting down to brass tacks.
Yep.
So we basically got kind of a wider civil war, probably roughly the same broad strokes in terms of territory at the start. You've got the South is for the sort of, for lack of a better term, we're going to use the ones that we know, the Catholic Confederacy, versus the sort of, Prussian Protestant Union up north. I think it's just going to be easier to keep using those terms because we're gonna fall into them at some point. So we might as well just go ahead and do it now.
The other parts being one, at least at the beginning, the Confederacy controls all of those Caribbean possessions.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. 100%.
Which is a nice chunk of land and goods to be sold on the open market.
You'd like to think that, wouldn't you?
Well, it's at least goods to be sold.
Keep in mind how I started that with at the beginning.
I said I agreed with that.
So now that we've kind of got our metaphorical table set.
Well, one last thing.
Yeah.
When they do split off, because we did, I do want to put the fine point on it. The Confederate Congress meets and basically copies the United States Constitution. The Confederate Senate invites Maximilian to their kind of rump throne, and the United States, the Union, invites the German Leopold, because at this point nobody's compromising on anything.
One's compromising on
We're
anything.
done with compromise.
I think basically the Belgian Leopold ends up being the John C. Bell of this timeline, where he maybe gets a few people who genuinely do not want to vote for either side, but he's not going to get enough popular support.
Yeah. So we've got so now we've officially got our butts in chairs, so to speak, at least on the thrones. But in terms of our metaphorical unpleasant Thanksgiving dinner, who are the other people sitting down at the table? What are because obviously the first thing that's going to happen is once we have a secession, once we have two opposing governments, the chessboard's going to start getting filled out. Who are we looking at, you think, and where, kind of on both sides? I guess probably the Union side is going to be more straightforward in terms of positioning. I think the more famous names to play around with are probably on the Southern side. So, what is the Union, for lack of a better descriptor, what does the Union position look like at the start of this little dust up?
Well,
in terms of military commanders, all that.
McClellan is McClellan is McClellan is McClellan. You're not going to change anything with him. So he's hanging out down in the East. I think Evan mentioned John Fremont.
John Fremont being the leader of the Northern Californians, because remember, we got to split California in this timeline.
Yep. So he's got the West. And I'm going to throw out that Ulysses S. Grant rises to prominence much earlier because we have a different connection set. So he runs the Central at the beginning. It's not, there's no Halleck.
I don't think he's.
You think we leave Halleck in place?
Well, I mean, think about what was Grant. Grant was on his way out in our timeline.
Yeah.
He was about to resign his commission in our timeline. So let's fast forward to that.
He already had. He had resigned and retired to Galena, working with his family in their tannery store.
and you are not going to take somebody off a tannery store and put them in charge of an entire front.
So we'll leave Halleck in play.
I mean, again, we're talking about like first
set. First
deal.
Yeah.
First
so we'll
deal
leave
of the
Halleck.
cards.
I'm okay with leaving
and I
Halleck.
agree that, what you're going to see in every conflict everywhere that lasts more than 6 months, especially in the American Civil War, is talent identifies itself.
Yep.
I think Grant will be identified. I don't think he's starting there, though.
Well, I do have another name. I don't think he becomes a sort of theater commander yet, but I do think he would be an interesting figure to put kind of potentially in play later in the center, and that's Sherman. Because he's from Ohio.
Yes.
And originally at the outbreak of the Civil War, he's some Louisiana, I forget if it's a military school or a technical college, but he leaves that when the South secedes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very easy parallel to say that maybe Sherman goes back up to Ohio instead of going to DC later, getting command after Bull Run.
I'm kind of liking
I'm liking that.
A Sherman Grant parallel to a Bradley Patton.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we reverse who the senior commander is. Maybe.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
I get what you're doing there. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm
liking that.
So we've got our West and our center sorted out for the Union. What about the East? Because I mean, McClellan Winfield Scott's dead, probably. He dies in 1866 in our timeline, but the Civil War's part of that. But he's also like 300 pounds and literally breaks the back of most horses. So he's not going to get more than
and he's not in good health either.
Yeah.
But I think he actually may be important because maybe we actually listen to him with a much wider front. If the front does extend all the way to the Pacific, he wanted to cut the Mississippi. Yeah. And I think he might, we talked a little bit off about who's going to be the marshal of this. Not that they're actually commanding a front, but the person identifying the strategy. Yeah. And his initial strategy was the Anaconda Plan, which did eventually win.
Yeah. I think in this timeline, and this is just putting a pin in an idea for us to talk about later, but I want to bring it up because the Anaconda Plan's come up. Because we have Caribbean territories, I do think the Navy is not such a one-sided thing in this Civil War. I think because more of it is is it a green water Navy or a brown water Navy, Robert?
We're green water now.
Green water. And there's more of a focus on
green and brown are kind of the same. You're kind of the same blue water Navy.
Yeah,
blue water is
Navy.
the like.
Yeah, a deep sea Navy.
It's what you think of as a traditional Navy.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is because we've had these Caribbean territories, there's been much more of a southern focus to at least some of our Navy, because obviously we want to have some ships out of New Orleans and Mobile and Florida protecting this Caribbean stuff. So once we get to the Anaconda Plan and the Navy, I think we're going to have a more even kind of distribution that we'll have to sort out. I just wanted to bring that up because we brought up the Anaconda Plan.
I think Anaconda is different, though. His Anaconda closes off the Gulf.
Yeah. I think
goes down
that's
to the Yucatan and then splits the Mississippi.
Because I think you really threw off what I was initially thinking by what you said, Dylan. But I still think, appointments to Annapolis are done state by state. And if you look at the naval commanders, there were name me a Southern admiral.
There wasn't one.
Yeah.
They all went to West Point.
But that's assuming, and this is something we just haven't even covered, because there may be a certain number of royal appointments to the Naval Academy in this timeline that just may shift that a little bit. I do agree. It's still going to be a Union stack, I think. I just don't think it's going to be as much of a stack. But that's something we may not have to worry about for right now.
There are probably going to be more consequential naval battles.
Yes.
At
least, especially in the Caribbean.
The Caribbean is a full on. At some point, you get a major Battle of Guantanamo Bay, I'll call it, at some point. Mobile Bay shifts Farragut.
Yeah,
it goes
I
into
think
damn the torpedo, speed ahead.
maybe an
It's-
actually successful Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yes. Yes.
No. Nobody is stupid enough to actually.
I know
land
nobody's
there.
actually going to try and invade the Bay of Pigs, but it was too good of a joke.
Yeah, no, I
Too
get
good
it.
to pass
I
up.
get it.
Yeah.
But
So
that
I've
is
been
so that
I've been a little bit quiet here
Yeah.
because I actually am wanting to throw this as a possible bonus feature for this episode. And I don't know if this will actually, with your guys' input, maybe we can throw this in the show notes or something. But while you guys have been talking through this and I've been, half listening, I've actually been creating a rough map of this timeline's Civil War and where all the sides align, where all the states align, that kind of thing. And so I'm giving, certain states to certain sides. I, of course, have the non-existent entity of Wyoming as a giant black hole. For those of you who are loyal listeners of the show, you understand why. But essentially, I'm giving, Canada, or not Canada, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, most of all of that area to the south. I would say most of what was in the South in our timeline, aligned with the Confederacy would be allied with the Confederacy still. But I've also split up 2 states just based on alignments. As you discussed, California is north and south. So I have that split on our map, between Confederate South and, the north. But I also have split Texas just because between more of an east and west sort of thing, because I think the interests of, the kind of more German, northern western area of the state is going to be so much stronger in terms of their allies and their interests to the north.
I'm going to agree with that. Has the native Texan on the podcast who knows his Texas history? Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the
Central
eastern
Texas
part,
is a problem.
The eastern part is going to be, I think, the part that allies with the South in this timeline. I'm also giving Oklahoma, which is the Indian Territory in our timeline during the Civil War. I'm actually giving that to the South as well, because in our timeline, most of the Indian chiefs were actually Confederate sympathizing. But I just wanted to throw this in here for you guys. Now you guys can keep talking while I keep making my map. But I think... Yeah, we got some interesting things.
I'm gonna give him that one because if we had a Prussian king early on and several monarchs throughout, and we're looking at things, the central Texas Hill Country area is a very big German area. Matter of fact, up until the 1950s and 60s, you could still hear German spoken in Fredericksburg, Texas. So.
And I also have desert states roughly. It's not an exact boundary. I'm just coloring them in yellow for neutral. So I basically Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, roughly that desert area, I'm going to call neutral.
Yeah. So that gives us kind of a good idea of the layout and the northern perspective. But I think, the most colorful names to any American who knows the Civil War, most of them are on the sort of Southern Confederate side. And we talked before we started about kind of a rough plan, but let's go through it so we kind of know what the organization is. I know we talked, so this is in this timeline, this is a French monarch on the throne in the South. There's a very famous Confederate general who has probably the most French name I've ever heard from any kind of American have, Mr. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard.
I only challenge, name a Frenchman with a more French name.
That's actually, that's a good point.
I mean, maybe literally Charles of Gaul.
Yeah.
Other than that,
I don't think you get much more French than that.
No. So we have in this timeline, we talked about how, and Beauregard was a very politically friendly kind of general. He had friends in high places in our timeline. He was a good ally of Jeff Davis.
He was the most astute political general in the South.
Yeah. So it's very easy to say that he has wormed his way into sort of the good graces of the king. So we're going to, we kind of decided he was going to be sort of the overall logistical kind of advisor to the king, your sort of Marshall-esque figure in the South, not necessarily quite so much because of skill, but more, not to say he was a bad general, but also more because of his political closeness with King Maximilian. But we've got the interesting one. I'm going to start out west because I know we talked about that, and that's kind of the most interesting one because we do have a Southern California. Well,
I'm going to pause before we drop it. For those of you that listen enough, this might be Robert Kossuth's Bismarck.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
So in our timeline, in the 1850s, Brigham Young actually inspired some issues and some tensions between the Mormon settlement and the United States government, the United States Army. And one of the people that was sent out in the 1850s to keep an eye on the Mormons in our timeline was a certain Albert Sidney Johnston. So in this timeline,
only man who ever served as a major general in 3 armies.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So he in this timeline, he, whether or not the Mormons actually did as much kind of potential, noise about rebellion, secession, whatever in this timeline, Johnson's out there to, at the very least, keep an eye on them. But when this dust up starts breaking out, I think he's the most natural choice to get sent out to the Western Theater to counter Fremont in California.
Yeah, he was in California along with a few other famous names, Lou Armistead and Winfield Scott Hancock. Armistead stays there. Armistead stays there with him and doesn't put his hat on his sword and run in front of his brigade during Pickett's charge. So he'll stay out there with him. And Hancock, of course, does go back west. Or east, rather, back home.
Yeah.
But
yes. So we've got Johnston taking care of things in the west, fighting off against John C. Fremont. In the center, we have old Nathan Bedford Forrest, because the center, on the Trans-Mississippi is kind of, especially on the western side, it's much more friendly cavalry country. So you want someone who's able to potentially maneuver quickly, especially if you have a northern Texas that is now in play. You're going to have to move around very quickly, have to deal with that. So you've got a Nathan Bedford Forrest character kind of, overseeing, much more hit and run cavalry focused center theater, at least in the beginning, before we start getting into, sort of Anaconda, type tactics. And then the East is really kind of interesting because one person who's probably not in a direct battlefield role that we might immediately expect to be is going to be, I think, Robert E. Lee. Because at this point, when this war breaks out, he is probably still at the Virginia Military College, the Virginia Military Institute. He doesn't have, in this timeline, the heart issues, at least not quite as evidently, that plagued him, after the first couple of years of his command in the Civil War, because obviously stress like that.
He was a little busy.
Tends to weigh on a person.
On.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's hanging back and not that a job, in a military institute is unstressful, but he's probably going to be in slightly better condition in this timeline, but he's also going to tend to be more of a, not ivory tower, but a more theoretical kind of expert. I think his immediate use to the sort of Southern French monarchy is going to be identifying talent, because he's got, graduating classes full of people that he's known, all of the best people. He knows who thinks like what, he knows what
he was
traits everybody
superintendent
has.
at West Point as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So
he developed the modern military school sort of curriculum, actually, is one of his calling cards. So that's where I think he starts out, as he's essentially the head of talent acquisition, if we're going to, use a sort of a Hollywood job description for him. But that leaves the commander of the East open. So I actually can't remember who we talked about as our main guy.
Well,
was it Braxton Bragg?
Bragg will get there. I think initially we still had Joe Johnston.
Yeah, Joe Johnston.
Yeah,
is our commander in the East versus McClellan. Kind of basically like our original time. So that sets up kind of our interesting pieces. So
did we discuss if Lee was going to be thrown in at some point, though? Because in our timeline, Johnston was essentially taken out of commission with, an injury in a battle. So I don't know if we went that far yet.
Yeah, I don't think we had gotten that far yet. And that was actually the next thing I was going to go to, is what, in our timeline, the East is the first big, the Peninsular campaigns and all that is the first big dust up. But does that happen in this timeline? I almost wonder if there
I
might
think
be
the
some tensions.
Caribbean
I think in the
becomes really
Caribbean,
important at this
the
point.
Caribbean, I
think-
think, is the central conflict
Yep.
of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Initially,
Yeah.
the Union North, instead of going and landing in basically Williamsburg, they take Cuba. Or they try
Cuba
Cuba.
is like the economic powerhouse. They're the engine that makes the Southern engine go in a lot of ways. So I think it's Cuba.
Yep, I 100% agree. And I'm going to say, because of the reasons we discussed earlier, the North being much more naval savvy and having more there, the Southern, while they're wanting to defend and work with Cuba and do the things in Cuba, the best case scenario is you get Stonewall Jackson thrown to Cuba to fight a defensive war, which Stonewall Jackson is not good at all.
Because here's another point I'm going to make.
Our timeline bears that out.
Yes.
In our timeline, the Peninsula Campaign played a major role in the Union identifying the importance of taking the large labor supply away from the Confederacy, because they were able to build fortifications very quickly. I don't see a Union actually fighting for very long in Cuba without realizing that it would be very easy to ship a couple of loads of muskets down there and just let.
Have fun.
Yep.
Yeah.
Basically, so Chris,
Remember
what
Haiti?
you're
Let me show you
saying-
how to do this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no, I
exactly
was
what I was
gonna
going to say.
say,
Toussaint Louverture,
we get the Haiti, we can get a Haiti rebellion going. We can get a John Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Either John Brown or a John Brown like figure.
I think what was his Benjamin Butler?
Butler.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. Butler is he's the perfect one, because he
Perfect
is the
candidate
one that
right there.
started up the what they call them, the contraband troops.
Yep.
If you watch the movie Glory, which needs to be on our list, by the way, gentlemen.
Yep.
I don't know if it needs to be on the list for that.
Yeah.
Well, not
It's a
for
good movie.
that,
Okay.
but
Not for our
as
list.
a movie to talk about.
Okay.
Hey, is this the first mention of that little secret project of ours?
No.
I don't,
What secret project that we haven't mentioned yet?
But
Yeah, you didn't hear anything from me, folks.
but they were the troops who were opposed. They were the other African American troops shown in that movie. And send Butler down. Let Butler start passing the muskets out, and let's have a good time.
Nobody at this time is trained to deal with that kind of warfare.
Yeah.
There's no way the Confederates can do it if you have somebody actively trying to support an insurgency.
Well, I would say the one guy who could fight that kind of warfare, he's busy commanding the Trans-Mississippi region.
Yeah. The only other, maybe Jeb Stuart would potentially be somebody else who could do it, but I don't know. We also don't have.
Jeb was more.
Jeb is probably going to be.
Cavalry.
And I think he's probably going to be the first person they send, because wasn't he a Texan, Robert? Or am I remembering that wrong?
Jeb is a VMI boy.
Okay,
He's a Virginia
so
boy.
he's going to be one of the guys that Lee immediately first picks out. I'm trying to think of somebody who, because I think the first mainland fighting that's going to break out is going to be in North Texas, because it's essentially going to be
Hood stays there because Hood was from Texas originally.
Yeah.
So
Hood leads the immediate northern Texan.
Earns his stripes in that northern Texas region, and the Confederate. I'm gonna give that one to the Confederacy as an initial win.
Yes, because I think
Hood is managed very well, and he does really well in subordinate command. And then you promote him, and it all goes downhill.
Well, now here's the question I have. As getting back to Evan's map, I agree that initially let's call to steal a turtle dove here.
Lubbock.
No, I was going to say just let's refer to those as Houstonians, especially because
good move.
Houston,
I like that.
Yes, I like that.
Okay.
Especially because
Good
Houston
throwback.
is like trying to keep.
Yeah.
Houston is very much serving that population in Texas in our timeline, opposing secession.
Yep.
So that's kind of who the North Germans are, Houstonians.
Yep.
Despite the fact that geographically that may mess some people up.
Yeah.
But I think initially Hood is going to have a lot of success there, but the thing is, I don't believe he's going to have a lot of success in long-term pacification.
No, he will not.
And that might be an ongoing thing for the central area, trying to get that settled down, because if you do have a center of gravity out west, then kind of the Panhandle, West Texas, Dallas area,
Mhm.
Yeah.
not
Much more of a
being
concern.
Mhm.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's I think that's why immediately that's going to be the first mainland fighting.
Mhm.
And then I wonder if that's then because the
Do we see
South is
California as the second mainland fighting?
that's kind of where I was thinking,
I
just
was
because
thinking
you've
that
got
too.
Fremont and Johnston out
Fremont
there. I
and
think
Johnston there.
Fremont, I
Mhm.
think especially is going to be angling for some positive headlines.
Oh, he's
assuming he's
super
anything like
motivated.
the Fremont
He
in our
is
timeline.
insanely motivated, especially in our timeline.
But
Yeah.
here's the thing. I don't have any objections to anything we're talking about yet, but from a numbers standpoint, from a logistics standpoint, I don't think any of this can compare to what's going to happen. Like, the numbers involved are nowhere near.
No,
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Yeah,
Like,
actually,
like these might be the first headlines. These might be,
yes,
exactly. These are
This
this
is
is the
bull
initial
run.
forays.
these are the
This is
bull
bull
runs.
run.
These
Yeah.
are the bull runs.
These are the little, oh, we're having a
Yeah.
picnic. This is an actual war.
But like, what we're gonna get it, but the numbers involved and the seriousness are nowhere near.
Well,
Yeah.
And I'm gonna say we keep Anaconda.
Uh-huh.
So I'm gonna lead the first battle that's gonna have a major, I'm gonna use the word oh crap moment to the country, is gonna be the same battle that did it in our timeline. And it wasn't Bull Run, it was Shiloh.
Shiloh.
Yeah.
And so we run the thing, and in the center we left who do we leave? Did we leave Halleck in the center? Sherman,
Forrest was-
sorry.
Yeah, no, Sherman was he's going to be probably a brigade or divisional commander of some sort. But I think we left Halleck in as the general in charge.
Okay. Well,
And
they
then
come
you've got
down and
Forrest facing off.
They get to Pittsburgh Landing, they set up camps, they do the whole thing. Bragg, if anything, Forrest, Dylan's favorite Civil War general, was
Least
even
favorite, more like.
was
I'm
more,
just
was even,
waiting until we can kill him in this timeline.
was even more aggressive than Johnston, charged forward, and because he even liked to get shot more than Johnston did, he's killed at Shiloh.
Yeah, I do wonder if the battle is not quite as hard of a. I do wonder. Let me put this a different way. I do wonder if it's fought slightly better by the Confederates purely because of Forrest's background, because this is his bread and butter country, baby. He's born in Chapel Hill, Tennessee. He lived in Memphis for most of his life.
Right.
He's basically got fingerprints all over Mississippi. So this is basically his backyard. So I think at the very least he might die, but I think it's a much closer battle when everything all comes out. It's not. It's a very closely fought thing. I think if Forrest is in command, because he understands some of the terrain advantages that some other commanders from other regions might not quite have as firm a grasp on.
He understands that, and also I think I almost want to say they come not only close, I would say the Confederacy might just win Shiloh.
Yeah.
Has a temporary win.
I think I would agree with that.
Like
almost
a Pyrrhic victory.
I was just gonna say that.
No.
Probably a
And
Pyrrhic
that's gonna be the
victory.
thing, is they're gonna lose enough men that because if you remember Shiloh happens, Shiloh only loses because you lost Johnston. And you lost Albert Sidney in the middle of it, and you had Beauregard take over, who was more into the look what we done. Let me write a telegram to Jeff Davis to tell him what I did to get my accolades. You don't have a Beauregard behind Forrest who's going to slow it down. If anything, you have somebody even as aggressive. You have Leonidas Polk as secondary in charge.
Yeah.
And the bishop didn't play because he's the one that got Rugel's together to throw Rugel's battery together that busted up the hornet's nest in the Union area. So the bishop, Forrest is killed roughly the same time Johnston is. Rugel's takes one look at it and says, "We ain't stopping, boys. They're going into the river tonight."
And I think that's what happens. I think Shiloh is a one-day battle.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other reason that Shiloh turned out the way it did is because it turned into a 2-day battle because the Union they kept a toehold on the other side of the river, and they had massive amounts of troops that came in the next day.
Yeah, well, they had Buell.
Mm-hmm.
Don Carlos Buell got there with the Army of the Ohio.
And
on that,
though nothing's happening to them, they're still there. And I think Shiloh, as a tactical victory for the Confederacy, happens, but in
Buell
terms
just goes further downriver, crosses over.
You think it's like a tactical
Corinth.
victory, but a strategic loss?
Screw it.
Not even a strategic loss, just a strategic non-entity. These troops do exactly what they do in our timeline. Mm-hmm. This almost helps the Union because it scares them into taking this seriously.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think so.
They take it seriously. They go down, and instead of crossing right there at Pittsburgh Landing, you can have the rolling hills and the ditches and everything else there at Pittsburgh Landing. We weren't going for there anyway. We wanted Corinth. Mm-hmm. We're going to Corinth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's something I also want to throw in here, guys, because something that I think we might be missing out on is the impact of shifting, because we got Maximilian here in the South, and we have the German Leopold in the North. But in our timeline, we have Maximilian messing around in Mexico on behalf of Napoleon III. We have a couple of guys, I think, that could also serve as, generals or field marshals or people that were involved in the Mexican conflict in our timeline. We could have them also maybe possibly be involved for the South in this timeline because they're not messing around anymore in Mexico. With kind of like with General Lee, like having health problems because of our versions of the Civil War. There's a couple of guys that I've just been looking at here. We have Frederick Faure, who was the Marshal of France during the Mexican campaign. He dies in 1872 in our timeline. He has some health issues that takes him out of commission in 1867. I don't think those happen. So we could have him possibly thrown into the mix somewhere. And then also, and I'm very sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Hungarian names. So this is probably going to make everybody who knows how to pronounce them cringe. But Count Ferenc Giale, he served in the Italian Wars of Independence. I think he's also in the mix somewhere too. So I'm throwing out these names just because I think we're talking from like an exclusively American context. And I'm not familiar enough with Leopold I to necessarily say what kind of people he would bring over. But I think a very interesting dynamic that might emerge from this Civil War is probably the beginning of the end of heavy, I don't want to say European involvement, because that's what started off the Civil War. But I think, and this is, I think, where we're kind of leading this episode, is this might just be the impetus for what leads to a reformation of, if not an outright abolition of the American monarchical system.
Well, you're also going to get, and I'm going to throw a name out that every Texan is going to cringe when I say it, but he is going to come out and play.
This is way too early for Mark Clark.
Oh, absolutely not. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna.
I was thinking, where's Santa Anna going to end up in this?
So I think
because and he's going to come in. He's going to come in on the Union side.
I think he's on the Union side this time.
Oh, he is 100% on.
Now,
the
one thing I do
because he wants
say,
Texas back.
Yeah,
I think Foye.
Well, and Mexico back too.
Remember how we started this? Foye there are no Frenchmen in the Confederacy, period. They are all back in
Yeah, they're fighting
France.
Germany right now.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
Oh, but they'll send money and guns to Santa
The
Ana.
only I do
They'll
think
try.
Well,
I think
so
that's
okay, there you go. That's fair.
An attempt was made. There was an attempt. I think it's going to
Yeah.
happen, but maybe not as heavy involvement as I might have implied in my little.
I mean,
I do
mini
think
rant
I do
there.
think Evan has a point though. I think there is going to be some French involvement more than in this, but it's naval involved
Yeah.
because the
Well-
Prussians are going to be blocked off
I
fighting against France in Europe. The French have a navy. They're the only other real European power at this point that has a navy that's any kind of close. Don't look at me like that, Chris.
Chris
I'm
is
going
giving
somewhere.
you the stink eye.
They also are the only other power that's involved in this in any way, shape, or form that has colonial possessions anywhere in the area.
You're actually telling me that the French Navy is the only major European navy
In this conflict.
in this conflict
Britain's
right
not
now?
in this.
Yeah, because Britain
Well, wait,
Britain's
was
not in
not
this.
here, and Britain was not involved in our timeline.
And
Correct.
Germany is in
Not
the
in this
North
one
Sea,
either.
not the Atlantic.
Correct. All of what you're saying is correct. However, I do believe that Britain would make sure that the conflict does not extend across the ocean. Britain does not want a large conflict. France is who Britain, if you look at invasion literature, which is kind of who the British think they're going to about to get invaded by, for the longest time, it's the French. They're worried about the French, and the British will throw their naval weight around to make sure that the French do not extend their power.
Fair point.
And I don't think this is a matter of the British actually getting involved. If you look at like the diplomacy of the South, of the Confederacy during our timeline, it's a very delicate balance they perform to play footsie with both the British and the French.
And the French.
Yeah.
And their interests are diametrically opposed. And I think you have the British not doing anything,
Yeah.
but just letting the French know, take the L.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Don't cross the Atlantic because they can stop. If the home fleet sneezes, the French Navy catches a cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only,
Yeah.
I guess,
Yeah.
I do wonder if there would be something, but you're right. It's going to have to be much more covert. They're
Because-
almost going to have to run stuff through French Africa and then smuggle it through Liberia and then back channel it to the Caribbean
Because
that way, which
let's
is going to
be
be too much of a pain.
Perfectly honest about this. Wouldn't Britain love access to all of those economic resources coming out of the American Caribbean now?
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think about that. You're right. Okay.
Yeah.
And
my idea's dumb. It's
another-
going back in the bag.
Well, here's another monkey wrench. Okay. We kind of, when we initially set up like the election, right, we had, the two Leopolds and we had Maximilian. Do we just assume that Belgian Leopold rides off into the sunset?
Yeah.
I think there's
by this
precedent
time
for that.
he's probably going to take his dad's place as king of Belgium.
I
around
think
this
that's what's
time.
going to happen here, because what I was thinking in my head was just this kind of crackpot idea of, well, maybe Leopold wants to, kind of like throw in I can see him throwing in his hat for either side, the North or the South, Southern interests, because he's kind of, thinking about his own pet project in the Congo, thinking about, what that might do for him if, the French Southern side loses. On the other hand, I can see him going for the North because he's very industrial, and kind of sees the South as a lost cause at a certain point. But I think I'm just kind of jumping too ahead of myself.
Yeah.
I think he's perfectly content once he takes the L in the election. He
He takes his ball and goes to the Congo.
Or-
I think he plays around in the Congo and in Belgium and does what he wants.
Or he calls his buddy, the Prince of Liechtenstein, and they go to Alaska.
Hey, there we go. Although we already gave Alaska to.
Oh.
I know.
I know you're joking, but that would have been a great way to give Liechtenstein Alaska.
Yeah, but I do think, in terms of, to get back on a more serious note here, I do think the war, I think, if anything, because the South now has to play both in the West in California They have this really narrow strip that they have to make sure that they hold on to underneath Mormon Deseret, Utah, and between
who
whatever
stayed neutral in this.
Yes, but whatever northern Mexico we originally took may have seceded, what may have stayed with the Union versus this Texas thing that we've got to deal with.
I have them staying in the Union. I have one part of like eastern North Mexico going south, but I don't think any of the desert states of northern Mexico have any motivation to go with the South here.
But I think,
really, Southern California is kind of cut off, in my view.
Yes,
from the rest of the South.
And I think what that does is, and this is kind of getting into more grand strategy thinking. I think what that does is that focus on trying to either keep or open the Confederate channel between, because they can't go through Panama, it doesn't exist yet. They have to go either all the way around South America or go through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all that. I think there's much more of a Southern focus, at least initially, on trying to keep that open. And that's going to divert some attention away from the East, and especially, I think, the center, especially after a Shiloh battle, where I think this is, it could end up being actually a slightly quicker long-term civil war, because I think the problem of the South is they're going to be stretched out.
They're stretched out
more than they were in our time. But the same tactics are still going to be a concern. They have to.
Go ahead, finish your thought.
No, yeah, I was going to say they not only have to just exist, but they also have to conclusively beat the Union enough that they can justifiably say, "Hey, we were right. Our king is the superior." So they're in a much more delicate spot.
They are getting drawn into the Caribbean as well. They are getting more dissipated. And here's the other thing. The Union has had 8 more years of industrialization. And if you look at where those trend lines were going, it was not in the Confederacy's favor.
Yeah. No. And the South stayed even more focused on agriculture than it did
100%.
In our timeline.
It almost got trapped in almost like a third world extractive economy.
Especially now with some of the attention that would have gone to southern states going to the Caribbean instead. It's even more of a rural agricultural Jeffersonian economy.
But, so we have it getting serious. We're right in the middle of everybody realizes this is a serious war.
Yeah.
The United States, the Union has invaded Tennessee. It's almost cut Tennessee in half at this point.
Yeah.
If they go on down to Corinth.
Yeah.
We've got the Bleeding Amarillo. Is that a good name?
Bleeding Amarillo is a good.
Bleeding Amarillo. The only thing I'm just going to say is I gave Kentucky to the South in this timeline just because of the agrarian interests as a border state. But I do agree with you, Chris, that Tennessee, I think, is going to be bifurcated in this timeline sooner.
And we're also going to have to split Virginia.
Yes, exactly. My map is like the start of the war. But I think Virginia's going to get bifurcated too.
I actually wonder if Virginia would be, instead of a regular and Western split, I almost wonder if it would be more of a northern southern Virginia split, because West Virginia is coal country, so it is resource production. It's not agricultural, but it's resource production, not factories. But the Richmond south of DC area is going to be much more industrialized. And in this timeline, we are now on French King number 2, and the French are going to prefer French areas, which means I think in this timeline there will have been, especially with a Caribbean focus, New Orleans, I think, is going to be a much more prominent southern city.
Okay.
So I think
I could see that.
I think because there's been a more long-term focus on New Orleans and Louisiana, I think this kind of the northern area around DC of Virginia actually may go north because it's closer to the industrial areas.
I do not think Northern Virginia goes Union. The Virginia split in their state legislature when they voted on secession. Loudoun, Alexandria, Arlington counties, the places right along the Potomac, all of them were still voting with the secession
Okay.
because they are all agricultural areas that just feed the Potomac.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I could kind of see where you're coming from with that, Dylan. But
Yeah.
no, I think
but
I
I
said with Chris on
do-
this one.
I do really like the idea of New Orleans as a
I think there's less strategic utmost importance on Virginia. It's still
Now-
important, but
that's the
It's
thing.
important, but
One, I love New Orleans as what becomes the Confederate capital.
I was gonna say
Yeah.
capital. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think those areas I outlined, everything between like DC and maybe down to the areas north of Fredericksburg, are occupied by the Union, not in a on the way to Richmond, more of a protective barrier to of Washington. And that's about it. Once Washington is safe, that's as far as they're interested in going. But then we do kind of focus on the Mississippi. I think
I think the Mississippi is where it's
Yeah.
going to end up being most of the critical
Yeah.
war dispositive fighting,
Mhm.
especially if you have New Orleans as a sort of a more natural Confederate capital.
Yeah.
Because then not only is getting the Mississippi going to cut the Confederacy in half, and if you get the Caribbean, it's going to enclose the eastern half. That also naturally puts it to capturing the secessionist capital if they get New Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which
Well,
I do think makes Vicksburg in our timeline become essentially. I think New
Yeah.
Orleans
New
ends
Orleans
up being what Vicksburg is in our
Yeah.
understanding
I think so.
because it's the capital.
I think
I mean-
Vicksburg becomes more important than it
Yes.
was in our timeline.
Yes.
We
Yes.
don't have a Gettysburg. You have
Correct.
Vicksburg. So in essence, South loses the Caribbean pretty quick in this.
Mhm.
I think we end up with in the Trans-Mississippi region, Bragg is killed off. They have a pariah victory at Shiloh, but the Union
Yeah.
captures Corinth.
And Forrest dies.
Yep, they are marked. Yeah, Bragg dies. Forrest dies.
Forrest dies.
Force
Yeah,
dice.
They are driving south down the Mississippi River because if New Orleans is the capital, the Eastern Theater is but
It's
the
not as
Mississippi
important.
Theater
And
is where
I think
it's at.
I've laid this out in another one. I think
Yeah.
John Keegan, famous British historian, wrote a book on the American Civil War, and he talks about at this point between Richmond, Washington, and even up to Baltimore is some of the worst terrain possible to fight over
Mhm.
because there are just so many rivers
Yes.
between the Appalachians and the Chesapeake Atlantic that it's a ladder that you're just constantly trying to have to cross these. If you don't have the draw of Richmond,
It's
the
not
United States cannot
It's-
leave Alexandria in Confederate hands. But as long as you control basically like what is today's Beltway, maybe
Yeah.
a little bit further so that your Washington is very safe, whatever.
You're
Well, and
good
this
to go.
this also draws potentially if the East is not as pressing of a immediate concern. Once Joe Johnston gets the initial theater stabilized and set up, if the South sees that New Orleans and the Mississippi is needing fortification, that's Johnson's kind of natural forte, especially at the beginning of the war. There's nothing to say that they don't ship him back to the area around New Orleans and on the Mississippi to help fortify. And
Or-
that leaves
And
Or
we
put him
have
in charge of
potentially-
Vicksburg. Put him in
Yes.
charge of Vicksburg.
Yes,
Yeah, he
and,
gets
and
Vicksburg.
we have the focus of Sherman's march to the sea, not through Tennessee and Carolinas,
Yeah.
Georgia.
but it's
we
straight
got to
down
march to the
Mississippi.
we got straight down the Mississippi to New Orleans. That's
Yeah.
General Sherman's march to the sea.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that,
All right.
that gives you, you can have Grant also emerge if he ends up coming back in this timeline. You can almost see Grant and Sherman or Sherman and somebody
It's
paired
Sherman
on
and Grant.
both sides of the Mississippi
Yep, coming
barreling
down.
down.
Mm-hmm.
with
Absolutely.
Yeah.
not Farragut. He had another general, another admiral he worked with, and I'm blanking on his
Might
name.
have been Farragut.
No, it wasn't Farragut. It was another one that worked with him, and I cannot remember who it was. But
yeah.
but they are coming down through Vicksburg, and so they are going to. So they are
Basically, they're looming over the Mississippi and the Confederacy at this point.
The Western theater is kind of just there.
Yeah, I almost say Albert
I think
C.
it's like a
Johnston
kind of a
does
tit for
good
tat.
work, but it doesn't
Yeah.
do anything because
I don't think it
California
really
is so far out of the way.
actually- Yeah, I think we have literally a sea of neutral territory between the northern southern Californians. They're kind of like the two brothers, just like over in the west. But there's like no real like way. I don't think the southern side would want to divert any of their resources, significant resources that need to be going to defending New Orleans, to trying to hold on to Southern California. They're basically just gonna say, all right, you know what? Good luck, guys. Unless you find a way to like convince Deseret to help us out a little bit. Like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. There's no real reason for them to do that.
Yeah.
But anyway, boys, this has been an amazingly interesting.
I think this sets up a good
turn of events.
A good kind of natural place to pause.
So this is what 1871, basically.
I was gonna say 1870,
1870 even.
70,
I think 70 because
I think 70.
Yeah.
Yeah, this may be like a 3 or 4 year war instead of a 4 or 5 year war.
I think it's a 4-year war.
But this gets us a good place to pause. We've got a good setup. We've got the South increasingly looking down the barrels of a metaphorical Union shotgun on both sides of the Mississippi River.
And this is where episode 5 comes in of our analogy. Last time we had episode 4, A New Pope. This episode is episode 5, The French Empire Strikes Back.
All thanks to Otto von Bismarck.
And so in episode 6,
I'm not allowing that. That will not stand.
In episode 6, we'll try and see how we finagle the Star Wars reference of Return of the Jedi into that.
But I do want to point out one thing. It hasn't been brought up yet, so I'm going to do it so that I
you're
control
gonna do
it this time.
Oh, you're going to do it this time. I was hoping we could go an episode without it, but
when the Union takes
the
Memphis,
Mississippi River,
they're going to build the supply depot in Memphis is going to be a pyramid of supplies,
a giant granary.
Hold on. You're talking about the Fort Rosecrans outside of Nashville, southwest of Nashville.
No,
small town.
The Bass Pro Pyramid.
Yeah, it's a Bass.
Yes,
it's the Bass Pro Pyramid. It's got to be that.
Sherman's just going to build a giant pyramid of supplies.
Yep,
100%.
I have to take ownership. I have to claim this.
Are we going to just keep wrestling over ownership of this thing over the rest of
the
Fork and Time's tenure?
It's less ownership and more custody obligations at this point, I think.
Actually, you know what I think it might be? I think this is what we should do, because by the time you guys hear this, you will have heard the first Roman episode, the Crassus episode. Who in the wrap-up of the episode remembers and can do the best throwback to Bass Pro? Because I wish this was a one for the face I was giving Dylan during the
that was
of
priceless.
The French Navy.
That was good.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've never felt judged so hard in my life.
Yeah, that was amazing.
And you literally go before judges. But 2, the resignation on Dylan's face when he saw where I was going with the Bass Pro at the end of the Roman episode.
Honestly, those are things of beauty. Sometimes I wish this was a video podcast format just for that alone.
Yeah, maybe we'll get there one day.
Maybe. But anyway, thank you so much, gentlemen, for a very well-spirited discussion. And thank you, all of you, dear listeners, for putting up with our banter and choosing to spend some of your precious eardrum real estate time with us for distinguished amateur historians. And so on that note, I think I'd like to end things off with what we usually like to end off at here at A Fork in Time. If you all see a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
turn it into a 6-episode arc.
Absolutely.
And take the fork.
And we take it. See y'all next time, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.